My name is Hannah Lowell. I'm 31 years old and I work with financial records for a living. I track numbers, permissions, transfers, the quiet details most people never notice until it's too late. That's why what happened at dinner didn't feel confusing to me, even if it did to everyone else. At dinner, I thanked my grandmother for the $300 check. I said it the way you're supposed to, calm, polite, no questions asked, because everyone at the table was watching my face, waiting to see if I'd smile, hesitate, or say something wrong. She stopped cutting the beef. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to make the room feel different. Then she looked straight at me and said, "The gift I wired you was $1 million. Nobody reacted right away. There was no gasping, no shouting, just a heavy pause, while everyone silently recalculated the story they thought they were living in. I didn't correct her. I didn't look around the table. I didn't ask why the check in my hand said 300 when she was talking about a million. I folded the check once and set it down, because the truth was, I already knew. I knew before that dinner, before the envelope, before she said the number out loud. I knew days earlier when something small didn't line up, and I did what I always do when numbers don't behave the way they should. I followed them. If you think betrayal comes with warning signs, it doesn't. It comes quietly, wrapped in paperwork, delivered by people who know exactly how much you trust them and exactly how little you'll question. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to subscribe or follow if you want more real stories where the truth only comes out because someone was willing to look closely. Because that dinner wasn't the end of anything. It was the moment pretending stopped. A few days before the dinner, my phone rang while I was finishing up work. It was Lauren. She didn't ease into the call or ask how I was doing. She spoke like someone who already knew how the conversation was supposed to end. She said she wanted to give me a heads up that things at home had been a little tense, that our grandmother had been tired lately and needed quiet more than company. She told me it might be better if I skipped coming back this time just to keep things calm. The words sounded considerate, but the timing didn't. Lauren had never worried about whether I should come home before, and she had never positioned herself as the person who decided what was best for everyone else. I asked what had changed, and she answered without answering, saying it wasn't anything specific, just one of those times when fewer people made things easier. Then she shifted the conversation casually, mentioning money, saying I shouldn't feel like I needed to come back for anything financial, that I was doing fine on my own, that I'd always been independent. She said it like it was a compliment, but it landed like a dismissal. The implication was simple and carefully phrased. Whatever was happening didn't require me. Whatever support was being given wasn't meant for someone like me. I didn't challenge her. I didn't correct her assumptions. I let her keep talking because people tend to reveal more when they think you agree with them. She went on about how everything was already handled, how there was no reason to stir things up, how sometimes showing up only made situations more complicated than they needed to be. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't concern. It was control wrapped in a tone that made it sound reasonable. She wasn't asking me not to come. She was telling me I didn't belong in whatever decisions had already been made. I said I understood and told her I'd think about it. That was all she needed to hear. Her voice relaxed immediately, like she'd been holding her breath. She ended the call quickly without waiting to see if I had questions, as if staying on the line any longer might undo what she'd just accomplished. When the call ended, I stayed where I was, phone still in my hand, replaying the conversation in my head. Nothing she'd said was openly hostile. That was what made it unsettling. Every sentence had been designed to sound practical, considerate, even generous, while quietly pushing me out of the frame. I didn't feel hurt so much as sidelined, like someone had decided my role in the family without bothering to inform me. Lauren hadn't asked whether I wanted to come home. She'd assumed the answer and built the conversation around that assumption. That was the part I couldn't ignore. In my work, the most important discrepancies are rarely dramatic. They're subtle shifts, small permissions, changed access, quietly reassigned. This felt the same. A decision had been made somewhere, and the call wasn't meant to include me in it. It was meant to keep me from looking too closely. That realization stayed with me long after I put the phone down, not as anger, but as a low, persistent sense that something had been moved, something that wasn't supposed to be touched. Later that night, when everything finally settled, I opened my laptop and logged into the account connected to Grace. I wasn't chasing a suspicion or trying to prove a theory. I was doing what I always do when something feels slightly out of alignment, checking the numbers in the order they're meant to be checked. Balances first, then transaction history, then permissions. At the top of the ledger was a deposit made in my name, a sum large enough that it should have demanded attention, conversation, paperwork time. Instead, it sat there quietly, processed without friction. I scrolled down expecting it to remain untouched. It didn't. Almost the entire amount had been transferred out shortly after it arrived, moved in a single action that left behind a small remainder just enough to keep the account from looking drained. That detail mattered. People who make mistakes don't think about appearances. People who plan things do. I checked the timestamps, then checked them again, looking for overlap or delay that might suggest a system error. There wasn't any. The sequence was clean, efficient, intentional. I called the bank and asked for confirmation, keeping my tone neutral and my questions narrow. The representative told me the transfer was valid. There were no alerts, no flags, no irregular activity according to their system. The access permissions had been updated correctly, and the transaction had followed approved protocol. That answer ruled out confusion and left only design. I requested the records showing when and how the access changes were made. When the documents arrived, they included a digital authorization form, standard language, standard layout, nothing unusual at first glance. At the bottom was my name, signed. Anyone skimming the page would have accepted it. I didn't skim. I know my signature the way most people know their own handwriting, not by how it looks in isolation, but by how it behaves. I don't sign quickly. I hesitate at the start, press harder on the first stroke, then ease off as I finish. I leave a slight irregularity where the final curve meets the line. The signature on that form was smooth from beginning to end. The pressure was even, the spacing too consistent, the final stroke too clean. It wasn't wrong in an obvious way. It was wrong in a careful way. That told me it wasn't copied once. It was practiced. I pulled older documents I knew were legitimate and compared them side by side. The differences stood out immediately once I stopped looking at the name and started looking at the habits. This wasn't a rushed approval or an accidental authorization. Someone had recreated my signature without understanding how I actually write it. I asked the bank who had initiated the change and where it had come from. The request originated from the same local branch Grace normally worked with, but the follow-up confirmations were handled through a different contact. The representative explained it cautiously, sticking to policy, making it clear they weren't assigning blame. From their perspective, the system had done exactly what it was instructed to do. That was the part that mattered. Systems don't move money on their own. They respond to instructions. I sat back and looked at the full sequence as a pattern instead of a problem. The access update, the timing of the transfer, the amount that was left behind, none of it pointed to uncertainty or miscommunication. It pointed to someone who knew how much could be moved without drawing attention and exactly when to do it. This wasn't an error created by confusion or urgency. It was deliberate, coordinated, and structured to avoid questions. By the time I closed my laptop, the unease from earlier in the day had solidified into something precise. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding or a family disagreement. I was looking at a controlled action that depended on one assumption: that no one would slow down long enough to trace it back. The following morning began quietly, but my thoughts didn't. I went back through old emails connected to Grace, not searching randomly, just following the paper trail the way it had been left. That was how I found Denise Turner's address, buried in a routine exchange that had once seemed unimportant. I wrote a brief message, introduced myself. explained that I was trying to clarify a financial matter involving Grace, and asked whether she was willing to speak. The reply didn't come immediately. When it did, it was cautious, polite, and careful, asking what the issue was and whether the conversation could remain general. We spoke later that day. Denise's voice was steady but restrained the tone of someone who understood the weight of what they might say before they decided to say anything at all. I didn't accuse, didn't speculate, didn't frame my questions emotionally. I asked about process, about meetings, about whether anything unusual had stood out at the time. At first, Denise stayed within safe boundaries, explaining standard procedures, emphasizing that everything on record had been properly approved. Then she paused. It wasn't hesitation caused by confusion. It was the kind that comes from deciding whether silence is still the right choice. When she spoke again, her words were measured. She said she remembered the meeting because Grace had asked a question she hadn't expected. Grace had wanted to know whether the changes being discussed were truly for me, whether the outcome would reflect what Grace intended rather than what had been presented. Denise said it wasn't an accusation, more like a quiet check repeated once more before the meeting moved on. At the time, Denise had answered professionally, explaining that the documents reflected the instructions they'd received. I asked who had provided those instructions. Denise didn't answer right away. When she did, she said the scheduling, the paperwork preparation, and the follow-up communication had all been handled by Monica Lowell. Grace had attended, but Monica had coordinated. Denise explained that this wasn't unusual in itself. Family members often help manage details. What made it linger in her mind was that Grace hadn't sounded relieved after receiving reassurance. She'd sounded uncertain, as if she were trying to confirm something she didn't fully control. Denise said Grace had thanked her afterward and said she trusted her family to handle things correctly. That line, Denise admitted, had bothered her later, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Trust had been stated, not demonstrated. I asked whether Denise had raised concerns internally. She said no, because there had been no procedural violation to point to. Every form had been signed. Every approval had been logged. Everything had followed the rules closely enough to leave no obvious reason to interfere. Denise stopped speaking for a moment, then added that what unsettled her wasn't the transaction itself, but the way the process had been guided. Grace's question hadn't been about amounts or timing. It had been about intent. Denise said she'd ignored that distinction at the time because it wasn't her role to question family dynamics. Hearing it again now, she said it sounded less like curiosity and more like doubt that had been quietly redirected. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The shape of it was clear. Grace had questioned whether the outcome matched her wishes. Monica had controlled the mechanics. Denise had followed procedure, and procedure had done exactly what it was designed to do. When the call ended, I didn't feel anger or relief. I felt certainty. This hadn't happened because someone misunderstood instructions or clicked the wrong box. It happened because the process was steered in a way that looked ordinary from the outside and resolved questions before they could turn into objections. Grace hadn't been confused. She'd been cautious. That caution had been absorbed and neutralized by someone who understood how to move things forward without appearing to take control. At that point, the missing piece wasn't evidence or explanation. It was acknowledgement that this wasn't an accident at all, but a deliberate direction masked as help, and that realization settled into place without resistance. Later that afternoon, I sent Lauren a message I had already decided on before typing the first word. I told her I wouldn't be coming back, that something had come up, that it was easier to stay where I was for now. I kept the tone flat and reasonable, the kind of explanation that doesn't invite negotiation. Her reply came within minutes, saying she understood, adding that Grace had been tired and that a smaller gathering would probably be better anyway. It read like concern, but it felt like relief. I didn't respond. I left the message where it was and put the phone down. Not long after, another notification appeared. This one was from Grace. It was brief, almost tentative, asking if I was okay. There was no mention of the dinner, No mention of plans changing, just that single check-in. I looked at it longer than I had looked at Lauren's message, not because it required an answer, but because it carried a different weight. I didn't reply. Instead, I let the silence exist long enough to feel its shape. There were two outcomes available, both simple, both clean in their own way. If I stayed away, everything would remain aligned exactly as it had been arranged. The story would stay intact, untouched by questions or presence. Whatever assumptions had been made would continue unchallenged, protected by distance and courtesy. Grace would believe things had resolved as intended. Lauren would continue managing outcomes without interruption. Silence would finish the work it had already started. If I went back, nothing would stay neutral. Even without confrontation, my presence would force attention. Conversations would shift. People would adjust their words. The calm everyone relied on would thin, not because I demanded answers, but because I was there to notice what didn't line up. I didn't frame either option as right or wrong. I framed them as consequences. I picked the phone up again and reread Grace's message. I thought about the way her doubt had been redirected instead of addressed, about how easily reassurance can replace truth when it's convenient. I thought about how quickly systems settle into patterns that don't require honesty to function. I still didn't answer. There was nothing I could say in that moment that wouldn't either close the door or open it too soon. Instead, I opened my laptop and began organizing what I already had, not adding anything new, just arranging facts so they could be seen clearly. Account records were sorted by sequence. Emails were grouped by sender. Notes were stripped of interpretation and reduced to what had actually happened. I wasn't preparing to argue. I was preparing to observe without confusion. When that was done, I booked a return flight. The confirmation came through immediately. I didn't forward. It didn't mention, it didn't correct the assumption I'd just allowed to exist. Packing took less time than I expected. I chose what I would need to stay composed, rather than what I would need to explain myself. Grace's message remained unanswered. Lauren's earlier reply stayed archived. There was no internal speech about bravery or obligation, no moment where the decision announced itself dramatically. There was only the quiet understanding that letting things continue untouched was also a choice, and one that required more effort than I was willing to give. By the time I closed my bag, the decision had already moved past reflection. What mattered now wasn't how anyone would justify what they'd done, but what would happen once the structure holding everything in place was exposed to daylight. The transition wasn't marked by an argument or a warning. It moved directly into the familiar setting everyone trusted, a dinner table prepared as usual, voices settling into routine, the kind of normal that only works when no one interrupts it. Dinner unfolded the way it always did in that house, carefully timed, comfortably familiar, structured to prevent surprises. The table was already set when I arrived, plates aligned with deliberate symmetry, glasses, polished, conversation kept light and neutral before anyone sat down. Monica moved through the room quietly, adjusting placements that didn't need adjusting, checking details no one else noticed. Grace stood at the head of the table, focused on the food, hands, steady posture, relaxed, completely at ease in the role she had always held. Nothing in the room suggested instability. When we took our seats, Monica reached into her bag and slid an envelope toward me, saying it was from Grace. Her voice was low, controlled, as if this were a routine exchange that required no attention. She didn't wait for a response. She simply leaned back, confident the moment would pass without friction. I opened the envelope calmly. Inside was a check made out in my name for $300. The ink was neat, the number written clearly, intentional in its simplicity. I folded the paper once and placed it beside my plate. I thanked Grace without hesitation, keeping my tone even, my expression neutral. She smiled back, satisfied, and the conversation resumed as if nothing of importance had occurred. Plates were passed, glasses were filled. Grace spoke about family, about continuity, about how important it was to take care of one another even when circumstances became complicated. She spoke with the assurance of someone who believed every matter in the room was already resolved. Then she referenced the gift she had transferred, mentioning it casually, as if it belonged to the past rather than the present. That was when I spoke again. I thanked her for the $300. The shift was immediate. Grace's hand stopped in mid-motion, the knife hovering above the meat suspended unnaturally still. She looked at me, not startled, but alert, as if recalculating something she hadn't expected to revisit. For a brief moment, no one else reacted. Monica didn't move. Lauren didn't reach for her glass. The room went quiet without anyone asking it to. Grace asked what I meant, her voice measured, careful not to reveal uncertainty. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I simply let the statement remain where it was. Grace slowly set the knife down, aligning it parallel to the plate with unnecessary precision, then looked directly at me. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, corrective rather than defensive. She said the gift she had wired was $1 million. The number settled heavily into the space between us, not because of its size, but because of the certainty behind it. No one moved. Chairs remained fixed. Hands stayed exactly where they were. Monica's posture tightened, subtle but visible, the first crack in her composure. Lauren stared down at the table, her hands folded too neatly as if movement might draw attention she didn't want. I remained still, neither agreeing nor contradicting, not filling the silence with reassurance or protest. This wasn't a misunderstanding that required clarification. It was a collision between two versions of reality, and the room understood it instantly. The check lay untouched beside my plate, small and undeniable. Grace looked from me to the envelope, then back again, her certainty beginning to fracture into something sharper, something unsettled. The silence stretched, no longer polite, no longer temporary. No one reached for a fork. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, compressed by the knowledge that whatever came next would not fit neatly into the structure they had all relied on. The dinner that had begun with such control was suspended in a moment. No one had prepared for a moment that refused to be softened or redirected. Everything stopped there, not in shock, but in recognition that the truth had already entered the room and would not leave quietly. The silence broke when I placed my folder on the table, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a continuation of what had already been said without words. I opened it and began in sequence, not jumping ahead, not rearranging facts for impact. First came the confirmation Grace had received the transfer amount, the timing, the reference line naming me without ambiguity. I let the page sit long enough to be read. Then I moved to the access change record, the authorization form bearing my name, the signature that looked correct, only to someone who didn't know how I sign. I didn't explain the discrepancy. I let the contrast exist. Next was the outgoing transfer, how quickly the money left, how little remained behind, an amount calculated to avoid attention rather than reflect intent. The pattern didn't need commentary. Monica leaned forward sharply, her voice cutting in before I could continue, accusing me of greed, of turning generosity into suspicion, of auditing family the way strangers do. She said I had always been focused on what I thought I deserved, that this was nothing more than resentment dressed up as righteousness. I didn't answer her. I didn't correct the accusation or defend my character. I turned the page. Lauren followed, speaking faster, saying the situation had been driven by pressure, that planning a wedding had overwhelmed everyone, that choices had been made quickly and without malice. She said stress changes judgment, that intention matters more than process, that no one had meant to deceive anyone. I didn't engage with that either. I didn't argue about stress or motives. I continued. I laid out the scheduling emails showing who arranged the meetings, who prepared the documents, who confirmed the follow-ups. Grace's name appeared as a recipient, not as the organizer. Monica's appeared repeatedly in roles that shaped outcomes rather than observed them. I showed the documented question Grace had raised, asking whether everything was truly for me, whether the result reflected what she wanted. That was the point where Grace spoke. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at Monica and Lauren and said she had asked carefully before transferring the money not once, but more than once, because she wanted certainty. She said she had been clear about who the gift was for and why she was giving it. She said she had trusted that clarity would be respected. Monica tried to interrupt, but Grace stopped her without raising her voice, saying this wasn't about pressure or confusion, that pressure doesn't produce forged authorization, and confusion doesn't require someone else to steer the process. She said she had sensed hesitation in herself for a reason and had been reassured instead of answered. The defenses collapsed quietly after that. Monica's accusations lost their force. Lauren's explanations drifted without landing. No one reached for the papers anymore because there was nothing left to reinterpret. Brian Scott, who had remained silent throughout, stood up without announcement. He didn't argue. He didn't look for justification. He took his coat and left the door closing behind him with a sound that ended the conversation more effectively than any words could have. Grace gathered the document slowly, her hands steady, her posture resolved. She said this would be addressed properly, and that there would be no reframing to make it easier for anyone involved. I closed the folder and leaned back, not feeling victorious or relieved. I hadn't come to confront personalities. I had come to restore alignment between what had been said and what had been done. In that room, with excuses exhausted and responsibility clearly placed, the truth no longer required my participation. It stood independently, unprotected by emotion and untouched by denial, and everyone understood that no argument offered had managed to move it. What followed was not chaos or public spectacle, but process. Grace and I filed the official report together, not as an emotional reaction, but as a correction that had been delayed too long. The documentation was submitted exactly as it existed, unedited and unemphasized, because the facts didn't require persuasion. The bank responded with procedural speed. An internal review was initiated, access permissions were suspended, and the remaining portion of the funds was frozen pending verification. There were no conversations about intent, no space given for reinterpretation. Once the discrepancies were acknowledged, the system moved forward without hesitation. Lauren's consequences surfaced first quietly, but decisively. Her employer placed her on administrative leave while conducting its own review, then ended her role without public explanation. Professional relationships she relied on dissolved without confrontation. Invitations stopped coming. People who had once defended her avoided association rather than challenge what had become obvious. Wedding plans unraveled without announcement. Vendors requested clarification that never came. Deposits were forfeited. The future she had spoken about so confidently lost momentum and then disappeared. Monica's collapse followed a different pattern. It wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. Her reputation eroded as questions began circulating in the same spaces where her influence had once been unquestioned. Friends distanced themselves without explanation. Social standing failed to protect her when credibility became the currency that mattered. Her marriage fractured under the pressure of exposure and denial, not through argument, but through absence and refusal to confront what had been revealed. The separation happened quietly and without repair. Edward chose silence throughout. He didn't attend meetings, didn't intervene, didn't offer explanation or resistance. His refusal to act created a division that settled permanently into the family structure. Grace acknowledged this without negotiation. She corrected what could be corrected and withdrew from what could not be salvaged. There were no attempts to restore appearances, no appeals for unity, no requests for forgiveness framed as closure. When the necessary actions were complete, I returned to my own life without ceremony. I didn't send updates. I didn't wait for responses. One evening alone, I opened my phone and removed each family contact deliberately, one after another, without hesitation or commentary. No final messages were written. No explanations were offered. I closed my laptop after deleting the last remaining thread and did not open it again. There was no dramatic sense of loss and no need for validation. The separation didn't require acknowledgement because it had been chosen consciously and without illusion. I didn't return to the house. I didn't revisit the table. I didn't look back to measure how my absence was received. That responsibility no longer belonged to me. The ending was not reconciliation or understanding. It was distant, stable, and intentional, holding its shape without apology. The story concluded not with resolution offered to everyone involved, but with clarity preserved for the one person who needed it. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.